comes time for the Q&A, we'll just pull things out of there in the chat section. So the book is called Evidence of V, and this is actually my 6th novel. And this was a book that was a very long time in the making, and a book that took me many years to kind of find the way to tell it. The story is, I've called it a novel in fragments, facts, and fictions, because I had long wanted to work with this material and could not find a way to tell it. Even though I'm a novelist, I wanted to draw on the actual factual information that I had gathered in years and years of research. And I wanted to find a way to incorporate that into an imagined story. So it's done in these small fragments, and the fragments are almost like puzzle pieces. They were, to me, puzzle pieces as I sort of tried to build a story, and they work as puzzle pieces for the reader, so that both of us are embarking on the same mystery together and piecing the mystery together almost in partnership as the book unfolds. And the story of Evidence of V really begins in 1935, but it also begins for me on a really cold January day in 2001, when I went with my mother over to the Gale Family Library at the Minnesota History Center. I don't know how many of you have gone there or have done research there. We were there because several months prior to that, I was at a party with a historian, Bill Milliken, who's written some books for the Minnesota History Center Press. And I was talking to him about my mother being an adoptee. And I mentioned to him that she had been born in Sauk Center. And as soon as I'd said to Bill that she was born in Sauk Center, Bill said, oh, there was a detention facility for girls in Sauk Center. She was likely born there. And I was very surprised to learn that. That wasn't something that my mother knew. And then he said, and those records are all being held at the Minnesota History Center. When he told me that at this party, I had this, tremendous sense that something was breaking open, because though I knew my mother was adopted, I was old when I found out. My mother was old when she found out. She was in her mid-30s when she found out she was adopted. And although she was adopted into the family, her mother and everything to do with her mother was a mystery within our household. So I knew nothing about this woman who had given birth to my mother. I didn't know really what had happened to her. And I, again, didn't even know that she had existed until I was about 16 years old. So I told my mother that these files were at the Gale Family Library and that maybe hers would be there. And we decided that I would call and find out. And I called the Gale Family Library, and I was put on hold for a very long time. And by this, I mean maybe 20 minutes. And that seemed like a long time for them to check on a file. And when they came back from checking on the file, they said, her file is here, but it is sealed for 100 years. And the news that the file was sealed for 100 years was, in finding out a file existed was a huge door opening. Finding out that the file was sealed was a door closing. And I knew that my mother wouldn't be alive for 100 years to see the file. And I didn't think I would be, I didn't think I would be alive either in the length of time that it would take for this file to be open. And they said the only way that the file could be opened was if we filed a petition with the Hennepin County courts, and if we had the death certificate of my mother's birth mother, and the Hennepin County court judge would review our case and make a decision whether or not to open our file. And I did it. I wrote the letter, and I made a case to the Hennepin County judge And the case that we made was that we felt, my mother and I, and in particular, I felt that this missing information about what had happened to her at her birth and who this woman was and the circumstances of her birth had had a long-term effect on our lives, had had an effect on my mother, had had effect on my siblings, had been something that had created almost a residual family trauma that nobody could name because nobody understood what had happened. And surprisingly, the court came back with the decision that they believed that full disclosure was in the best interest of the family. And when we went that day, again, going back to that January day in 2001, when my mother and I went down to the Gale Family Library and we asked to see the files, the first thing they said is, no, the files are sealed. And then she proudly pulled the paper out of her purse and said, I have permission to see the file. And it was this just triumphant moment that this thing that had been kept from her all these years was now going to be made available to her. Information about her own beginning and her own life. When they came out with the information at the Gale Family Library, they had kind of a cart and there were boxes on this cart. And the boxes were filled with reports that the institution had filed with the state. There was an old ledger there. And then they gave us a very thin file. And that was the file of my mother's birth and my mother's birth mother, the character that I call V in the book, when I'm looking for the evidence of V, the search for her. And looking through V's file, some of the first things that I saw was that she was 15 years old. I saw that she was an inmate. The use of the term inmate was surprising and confusing to me because I think I had thought it was something closer to, say, an unwed mother's home than it was something that had inmates. And that was one of the things I didn't understand. And she was 15. We saw that she was working as an entertainer in a nightclub in Minneapolis on Nicollet Avenue. And I had known and had been told that she was a very talented singer and dancer. And that crossed into my own life because I have a son who is an actor and a singer and a dancer. So we had this incredibly talented child that we couldn't really account for where he got his performance abilities. So I'm looking at this file and I'm like, oh my gosh, she was singing, she was dancing, she intended to be a performer. That was her aspiration. And then I turned to this page that was incredibly shocking in the file. And I'm going to share part of the page with you right now. This is one of the legal documents that appears in the file. In the name of the state of Minnesota, you, the said sheriff, are hereby commanded and required forthwith to convey the said V into the custody of the superintendent of the home school in Sauk Center, Stearns County, Minnesota, and you, the said superintendent, are hereby commanded to receive the said V into your custody, and her there safely keep until she shall become 21 years of age. So the line 21 years of age literally stopped me in my tracks looking at this file because I quickly stopped and did the math. My mother was an accountant. She did the math quickly, and both of us said, she was 15 when she entered and she was sentenced until 21. The length of that sentence was shocking to us because both of us are familiar enough with the criminal justice system to know that a 6-year sentence is pretty significant. The problem was there was no mention of a crime in the file. So we had no way of knowing What had she done that had warranted a 6-year sentence? My mother was, overcome with emotion because we did know that V was pregnant with my mother at this moment when she was picked up by the authorities, brought in, and given this sentence. She was pregnant with my mother, 3 months pregnant. And my mother felt, this tremendous amount of guilt that she had been this infant in utero who caused her, a 15-year-old girl, to go to a youth prison for 6 years. But how and why a pregnant girl would be sentenced for 6 years was also a mystery to us. Another of the mysteries was that we saw in the file that she had been breastfed for 3 months while she was there. And although this was 1935, it still struck us as odd that she had been breastfed and then taken from her mother. But she had been taken from her mother. We knew that because it said in the file, and she was placed with a family where she was ultimately adopted. So we had this question too: why the breastfeeding? Why the 6-year sentence? What had she done? What did it mean to be an entertainer in a nightclub in 1935? What was this place? Was my mother kept with her mother in the 3 months that she lived there? What kind of life did the girls have there? How many girls went? Where did they come from? Was this something that just happened in Minnesota? Did this happen everywhere? And then paging through the school ledger, I saw a entry just by chance with her name that said that she had on that day a handwritten entry that said she had escaped parole. So I didn't understand what parole was. What did parole mean to this girl at this institution? And what did it mean that she had escaped? Those questions, the encountering of these materials and the amount of questions that we left there with that day showed me that this story was far from being solved. The mystery that I had kind of thought, if we get these papers from the court and we go in, we're going to understand all this stuff about our family. But in fact, there were more questions raised than answered that day at the History Center. And I left that experience wondering how I was ever going to get these questions answered. There was virtually nothing available to the public about the Minnesota Homeschool for Girls in Sauk Center. There was very little on the internet. There was a entry from the Historical Society that mentions it under the prison system. I did learn early on that it was in fact one of the prisons in Minnesota, and that's why they were considered inmates. And I then began a long process of trying to do research on institutionalizing girls, or the institutionalization of juvenile offenders in America, female offenders in the early part of the century. And the odd thing was, I couldn't find anything about the 1930s, and I couldn't find anything about the Minnesota Homeschool for Girls in Sauk Center. And it felt that not only had V been erased, but the girls who had been there with her had been erased. And I met with some people in Sauk Center that were involved with the Sauk Center Historical Society. My husband and I, they brought in a couple of people that had worked there in the 50s and the 60s and up through the 1990s when it closed. It was open for a very long time. I knew that it had opened in 1911 because that was available through that one little piece of information was available on the Historical Society website. And, they had said what a lot of people had said, which is, it was the people, there was a mystery around the school and around the girls unless you worked there. But the girls were, you know, kept out at this facility, and people who lived in the general area did not really know what went on in the school. And certainly the people back in the towns, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Winona, Duluth, all the small towns across Minnesota that had girls sent there also did not know what was going on at that school. So there wasn't really anyone that I could find to answer these questions about what her experience had been at this place, or what went on with those girls and what happened to those girls. And then in probably the mid 2000s, at some time, maybe 2013, 2014, I had a breakthrough interlibrary loan where I was able to order a book of reports called the Juvenile Delinquent Handbook. And the reports were compiled by an organization called the Osborne Association, which was out of New York and exists still in New York. And the Osborne Association was committed to prison reform. And in 1937, the Osborne Association set out across America to investigate what was happening in juvenile detention facilities, because people just didn't know. The general public did not know what was going on in these facilities and who was overseeing them and what kinds of treatment the girls were receiving or the boys were receiving. Here in Minnesota, the boys' school that they visited was Red Wing. And quite for my great luck, one of the first places that they went to investigate was the Minnesota Home School for Girls in Sauk Center. So here in this very old book that was basically like rubber banded together, I opened to the pages of this report, and I suddenly understood all of these things that I had not known before. And one of the first things that I discovered was that all of the girls, whether they were sent at 8 or 10 or 12 or 15, all of them were sentenced until the age of 21. So a girl entering that school at 8 would have been kept there for 13 years. And all of them stayed at the school until the age of 18 when they were paroled. And that is where I discovered what parole was. And parole was the placement of the girls out in private homes where they would learn how to keep house. They were at the school trained to be servants to families. So that was the vocational training that they received. And the vocational training to be housekeepers or servants in homes was incredibly rigorous. They completed one thing like ironing or, laundry or something, and it took them a while to complete it, and they had to complete it to the satisfaction before they moved forward. I also learned that they were responsible when I wondered what went on there. How were their days spent? Well, that was in the Osborne report. And I learned that they worked very long hours every single day, that they were in charge of all of the work for the school, the maintenance, the fields. They did all of the laundry, all of the ironing, all of the cooking. They served meals to the staff in the cottages where they were kept, and then they served the girls separately. They ate in silence. They had very little education. They received minimal grade level education. The school did not put much emphasis or belief in the girls being able to do well in school. And then I found, which was a document, and I share this with you historians because this document was quite remarkable. And this is a speech that was given by the founding superintendent of the school in 1919, where she was speaking before the welfare board, the child welfare board, and the state board of control. And the state board of control is what they called the board that was in charge of the prisons. And her name was Fanny French Morse. And I'm going to read you a few minutes of Fanny's speech here. And it's excerpted, so I'm going to be jumping around a bit. Now that I may keep to my subject, I may show you in a more intensive way the purpose of our institution, our Minnesota homeschool state institution for delinquent girls. On petition or complaints of parent, guardian, or officer of the law, any girl, if found guilty of incorrigibility, immorality, vagrancy, nor is an actual offense always a necessity, girls have been sent to us in danger of becoming delinquent, incorrigible, immoral. So the question that I had about what was V's crime, and seeing in all of the reports over and over again that the girls had not committed crimes, and then within the Osborne report discovering how many girls had been sent to the school that year for the charge of immorality and several for incorrigibility, it became clear to me what the situation was with the girls. But I'm just looking for the statistics here. So here are the statistics for the fiscal year 1936 of the girls admitted. 1 for disorderly conduct, 10 for incorrigibility, which was a vague offense, but was not a crime, and certainly was not a 6-year crime. Truancy, 3. Immorality, 79. All others in this class, 1. The charge of immorality, it became clearer to me reading through the reports, was more often than not a charge of having been a victim of sexual abuse or sexual assault, because the girls were frequently referred to as sex delinquents. But as in the case of V and in the case of other reports that I've had access to, V was impregnated by a 35-year-old man, and that it was right in her file. And the thing that was very powerful for me was to think that these girls, just like the girls who were abused by Jeffrey Epstein and various people today, were the ones themselves who were sentenced while the men went free. And to be sentenced for this length of time, whether it was 6 years or 8 years or 13 years, was absolutely unconscionable. It really is it's like a historical atrocity that isn't even known or part of our vocabulary in Minnesota. So then she goes on and she says, she talks about the life with the girls at Sauk Center. 310 girls with 270 in care in the community. The motive of the institution, a social readjustment of the girl, who through disadvantage has become a social offender or social misfit. Its purpose, the making of decent wives and mothers and homemakers. And then it goes on to talk about the work that the girls do there. Society's greatest need today is the home, to grow in this girl this home sense, a consciousness of the possibilities of a home. The home is a factor in the building of women. The girl's first loaf of bread is to her a greater pride than is many a college diploma. Farm work and gardens, planting of shrubbery and trees, mowing of lawns, as a means of humanizing the girl. I refer to the actual production which the farm labor of our girls today represents. This last year, over 900 acres were cared for, over 500 acres of this under field and garden cultivation, largely the work of the girls. So what I came to understand was that the girls had a very difficult life there. And if I wondered about V, I didn't have to wonder very far about what had happened to her at that school. I learned about the discipline practices. There was no record keeping of the discipline, but the discipline included, I have this excerpt from the report. I'm going to just quickly share that with you. The discipline included, oh, here it is. The various punishments include deprivation of privileges, confinement in a regular room, extra or unpleasant work assignments, corporal punishment, cold tubbing, segregation, isolation, and delayed parole. I discovered in these reports that girls could be put into solitary confinement for months, 3 months, 6 months, on a restricted diet in which they were fed like bread and milk, and were not allowed to see anybody during that time or have any contact with the others at the school. And I learned also that many girls attempted to escape from the school. The statistics on attempted escapes was very high. When the girls escaped from the school, they were put into solitary confinement, subjected to very harsh punishment, these cold tubbings in which they were held underwater in ice, and until they acquiesced or changed their attitude. Essentially, their head was shaved. When I toured the buildings, I saw that the light switches were in the hallway so that they shut off the girls' lights at night. There were locks so that from the outside, that the girls could be locked into their facilities. But the one mystery that I hadn't understood until I got deeper into it was this business of paroling the girls into homes in the community. And the girls were paroled at 18, and they were to be paroled from the age of 18 as a housekeeper until the age of 21. But I discovered in the reports, and I discovered in looking over the Xeroxings that I had done on my daily ledgers, that a very high number of girls escaped parole. In 1 year, in the time that V was in parole, 85 of the girls who were out on parole escaped. And I began to ask myself, why were girls escaping parole if they were so happy in these wonderful homes that they had been placed in with these loving, caring families? And I had the answer to that in part when I found a dissertation done by a doctoral student at the University of Minnesota on the Minnesota breastfeeding law. Do you remember that I mentioned that my mother had been breastfed for 3 years, or for 3 months? Well, I found in this Minnesota breastfeeding law that by law in the 1930s, Minnesota required any girl who had, or woman who had a child out of wedlock to breastfeed their infant for at least 3 months, regardless of where they gave birth. And they required the breastfeeding, this is a quote, as a form of reparation for bringing a child, an illegitimate child, into the world. And the sense was that the girls would think twice next time, or would carry, the memory of this with them before being sexually active again. Again, incredibly punitive for girls who were victims of sexual assault or abuse. And so the girls escaped from these parole homes, and V escaped from her parole home. And I knew that from the school ledger where I had seen that brief entry. And I also realized that V was never captured again. She was never apprehended because her file ends there. For V to escape that home, if she had been apprehended, her sentence would have begun over, her training would have begun over. And as I learned, so many of the girls who escaped too many times ended up at Shakopee Prison, which was open at that time as well. And it was kind of a pipeline straight to there if you had too many escapes. So V escaped from Minnesota and was never able to return because she would have lived her life as a fugitive. The problem with this history and these girls is that there was so much mistreatment of these girls and so much shame and so much blaming these girls for having been victims and failing to give them appropriate treatment, that when the girls left these places, they did not tell people that they had been incarcerated. Ella Fitzgerald, at the exact same time, the jazz singer, was incarcerated at the Hudson School in New York at the same time that V was incarcerated. And she had never told anybody. Nobody knew this about Ella Fitzgerald, like nobody knew this about most of the girls until a biographer had been able to uncover the story. And it was just something that she did not want people to know, though they have found since in the records that she too was tubbed, abused, beaten, everything else at the Hudson School. The silence of the girls, combined with the sealing of the files and the silence in Minnesota around this school, has made it nearly impossible to bring this story to light. People don't know that their relatives were there unless they find something they find them in a census, or they happen to find out, like we did, that their grandmother or their mother was born in Sauk Center. I have heard from a few people who have come forward who were themselves there and have said to me, I was there, and it was a horrible experience. Or people have told me that their mothers were there, or their grandmothers. But the challenge for us remains, I think, right now in dealing with this history is how to get a comprehensive history of a place that was open from 1911 to 1999 and changed through the decades, had different leadership, had different treatment plans for the children who were incarcerated there. And how do we do justice to these girls who were wrongly incarcerated and have never had their truth told? So that's part of my mission with this, is that I'm hoping that I will hear from people and that somehow we will be able to create a larger story around this than just the work that I have done with V. So I'm going to go to questions right now because I've talked and talked and talked. And some of you have put questions in the chat, and I can look at those. Oh, my grandmother was committed to Sauk Center in late 1929 and spent several years there. Yes. Is it Linda? Yes, yes. Oh, that day that you came over meant so much to me. That I learned, Linda and I were able to get together here, and she had her grandmother's file. Was that a good day for you too? Yeah, I mean, we just, there was so much in her grandmother's file that was like a direct echo of these. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking it's 1929, then 1935, and it's the same story replaying itself and the same treatment of these girls. Have you run into anybody else, Linda, since this time?
No. And I learned so much from you. I remember that afternoon we got together too, and I'm still grateful.
And I think we will again, because you look at that file and you look at it, you could look at it over and over again. And it's almost like I looked at V's file so many times with like a fine-tooth comb, and all of a sudden something would rise out of it. And I think, well, where did that come from? And what did that mean? But, one of the things that was so meaningful to me was in that file, and so horrifying is actually the word, was, and I think it was this file, Linda, where they taught, you can clearly see them aligning with the man that sexually assaulted her, right? Isn't that in the file where they talk about?
Yeah, when she was on work release, there was an affair, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Or the man, when she was real young, and they talk about the banker, and they're like, he's a well-dressed, and...
Yeah, that's when she was on work release, yep.
He's such a lovely man, and he was like 25, and she was a kid.
Yeah.
And they also... are talking about her being lazy, not wanting to take care of her younger siblings in a And there
Oh,
were a lot of them, weren't there?
yeah, they were a poor Finnish family in Duluth, Minnesota. And I'm not sure that the parents had good command of English and knew everything that
Yes.
was going on. Yeah, I don't mind sharing. My grandmother was committed to Sauk Center when my late father was 18 months old. And
Oh,
then
yeah.
that pregnancy that you were mentioning started when she was on work release in Minneapolis.
Yeah.
And another interesting thing I learned from Sheila, that Duluth girls were placed in Minneapolis homes on work release. Minneapolis girls were placed in Duluth.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. And I also think one thing that is so moving to me, and as we go into winter now again, I just think of what was involved for these girls escaping from these homes.
Mhm.
You know, like to be in the winter in Minnesota and escape from these parole homes, they had to have a reason to run. They really did. I mean, they had no money. They had no resources. It's before cars were everywhere. And, you know, how are they going to get to, you know, how's B going to get from wherever she's placed back to Minneapolis, you know? And this was true of the girls everywhere because they were placed very far from their homes and they couldn't tell anybody where they were either. Like when they left Sauk Center, they weren't allowed to have any communication with anyone from the school, and their mail was censored. Their mail was censored at Sauk Center, and it was censored when they were in parole homes too. So good. Let me see. Somebody else said she was working in a club at 15. She was. And you know what I found out? That's Mary Kay. That was not even remotely unusual in America. So many performers came out of working in these clubs and became quite famous performers in New York on Broadway and movie stars. And this was before, you know, Prohibition and Speakeasy. They had young girls singing and dancing and kids coming into clubs and singing and performing for people. So that was not any kind of a crime. And that doesn't amount to any kind of a problem in the file either. I mean, we think it's a problem, but it's interesting that that wasn't a problem. And in part, I think that wasn't a problem because men were the customers, you know? And again, everything in the criminal justice system favored men. You know, it wasn't set up for children. It was set up to protect men's interests. What was the population of girls? 60 or so new ones each year? No, I think it was about 120 new ones every year, or 100. And then quite a number of them return. So if you sort of parse it out to be about 100 a year, and you know, 10 years to the decade, and the school was open 8 decades, that's 8,000. Am I doing that right? That's like 10 years. Yeah, 8,000 girls or something. And then if you think of that across America, these schools were in every single state in America, and they all followed the exact same philosophical methodology. It was like a cottage industry. Same with the boys. They did all the work. And the labor could be very, very difficult at the places. In a number of the schools, the girls were whipped. They were forcibly sterilized in this time period. We don't have evidence that that happened in Minnesota at the Sauk Center School, but it may have, because what am I thinking of? The word all of a sudden, it's escaping me. Anyway, this was something that was happening all over Minnesota at this time. So let me see. Oh, you found out. She found out from the census. Who's got that word on their tongue for me? I cannot believe I am forgetting it. Anyway, it was a movement. It's in the book. I know the word, I use it all the time, but it was a movement to sort of get rid of the lesser species. Eugenics, thank you. I keep wanting to say epigenetics, but eugenics, thank you. Let's see, thank you for, okay, good.
Could
Yeah.
I ask, I asked the question about population, and I'd like to have a better notion of, does that mean there were maybe 500 girls there at a time?
Well, I don't know. No, Fanny French Morrison, this says 200 and, oh, she says 310 girls at the school with 270 in the community.
Okay. Okay.
Oh, that's 500. Yeah, 5 something. Somebody else. Oh, I've got a college professor here. Oh, wonderful. Who you teach on the Native American boarding schools, the parallels between the histories. Yes, I think there are a lot of parallels, and the same people that had these ideas about rescuing and rehabilitating and reforming and creating a better human being, they're all tied together in terms of like philosophy. It's interesting because in some places they have religious affiliations. These institutions in America for the girls were under the courts. They absolutely were under the courts. In Ireland, they were under the Catholic Church, but and we know about them, the Magdalene Laundries. There's been Philomena was the movie on them, but here in America, it was with the government. How was the name of V chosen? It was just chosen as a pseudonym and as just a letter to stand for a human being. I made a decision very early on that I was not going to be using V's name, and I also made a decision, which is why it's called a novel in Fragments, Facts, and Fiction, because I made the decision that I knew that I would never know the truth about V's life. Never. There was no way, there was nobody to tell me, this is what really happened. And even if I had a relative to tell me that, they weren't there. They didn't live what V lived. And I know that as a fiction writer. They weren't there when V conceived my mother. They weren't there in all the intimate moments of her life. And in fiction, you deal with intimate moments. So I made the decision that I would bring V to life by inventing her through my research. And part of the book is the invention of V. So as you move through it, you will see that I am inventing her story, inventing possibilities for her. But also, she is V and she is all of the girls everywhere, so she's not, to me, she is one person in this book, and she is also representing the girls that were incarcerated across the United States. When did it finally close and what happened to the girls? It closed, I understand it closed in 1999. And by the time it closed, there were boys and girls there. And, Minnesota then moved to, that was the state institution. Minnesota then moved to county. They always had county homeschool in Hennepin County homeschool. There might've been a Dakota County homeschool for girls. But then they had more of smaller facilities, and also private prisons, exist. Private rehabilitative facilities exist in Minnesota for girls. And girls are still across the United States incarcerated in private facilities where they are kept in solitary confinement, physically punished. They report being hit, they report being raped, and they are most likely still to enter the criminal justice system, not as offenders, but as victims of sexual abuse and sexual assault. So that has borne out through all of the generations. That's the thing that is most likely with the girls. Oh, there's 5 people here from the League of Women Voters, Edina Book Club. Oh, thank you. You'll be meeting next Saturday to discuss the book. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. That's a fabulous thing. Thank you for coming to this. A composite, was it racially integrated? No, it was not. It was racially segregated. but there's very little written about that, about Sauk Center. I mean, again, I'm in trouble. There's not a lot written. But in one report that I found, the girls were kept in a separate cottage, the girls of color who were predominantly African-American girls. I'm trying to see in here, I have the report on by the race of the girls. The girls were predominantly white. Here it is. Oh, and this also answers, I can't think of what your name is, but the gentleman who asked the earlier question, girls in the institution on June 30th, 1937 by race. White, 247. So there we've got that. Negro, 7. Mexican, 1. Indian, 25. So that's of interest to you, to the professor in the audience with the Indian boarding schools. Other, 1. Total, 281. I will say that in other states, in Kansas, in many, many other states, they had segregated schools, home for Negro girls, and then the other institution, the other juvenile detention facility. And the treatment, I can see that the treatment was unequal even within the places where they were kept separated in terms of the work that they did. But if people are interested in that, I have a very extensive bibliography in the back of this book that will lead you down many rabbit holes, like it led me down many rabbit holes. There's not a lot on this, but what exists, I have managed to find. The other point I wanted to make, though, about the girls in Minnesota, a very high percentage of them, V included, had immigrant parents. So the kids were first generation. And Linda mentioned hers was from a Finnish family. My great-grandmother was a Norwegian immigrant, so this still remains a problem for poverty and immigration, for people trying to navigate America and make a living in America. And again, how to make a living in America in the middle of the Depression, when you're trying to feed a family. So it was a different time. And Linda is saying here that the 1930 census showed a few Native American girls. Yeah. It'd be interesting to know, is the researcher here in the audience, like maybe how they ended up here rather than the schools, than the Indian boarding school? Maybe pregnant? I don't know.
I'm the person that asked that question. I'm Carissa Wyant.
Thank you, Carissa.
Yeah, and I had no knowledge of this before I found your book of these schools, but I've taught on the Native American boarding schools for a number of years. And I will say it's interesting too to me that the records are very hard to access.
Yes.
And that the records are very scant.
Yes.
There are more records about, how many loaves of bread they had and,
Yep.
those kind of economic records than there are about the actual people that are in the schools. So that the parallels are just very striking to me.
Carissa, will you get in touch with me afterward just so I can know about your research? You can just connect with me through my website.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you.
I just am real interested in this. Also, I want to say that I don't know if you found this, but the record keeping feels unreliable to me. When I can read the bias in the record keeping, and I ended up going down that rabbit hole and finding out that there's a whole study in the bias of record keeping that happened in that period of time. But you can tell that they don't hold the girls in high regard. There's a lot of shaming and blaming and negative things, like Linda's shaking her head. I mean, I think they called her lazy at 12, like, she's lazy. You can tell that the people that were working with the girls were not on their side.
Yes, I think that's true. And I also think, and I would be interested to know if this has been a part of your research, that oral histories are some of the most telling and truthful kinds of ways to get at the information about, what actually went on. And I know, at least from your perspective of talking about how you're not able to make those connections,
No.
with your own family, I'm wondering if there's a way to find any, survivors today to fill in some of those
I'm
gaps.
trying so hard. And that's one of the reasons I keep going everywhere and talking, because I keep thinking someone's going to see this and people will come forward. But the oral histories are missing, and nowhere in any of these documents, in any of them, including newspaper articles about the school where they talked about what a wonderful place it was, nowhere are the girls' voices ever heard. There's no record of the girls speaking for themselves. There is a really good project out of New York called the Incorrigibles, and there's links to it online, and there's a great film about the Hudson School, the New York training school in Hudson, and they have gathered some oral histories, some testimonies, but not as many as you would think, for, again, when you're talking about how many people went through there. But many of these people moved away. Linda, didn't your person move away?
Yeah, she later, and the archivists at the Gale Library were so happy when I shared the story that my grandmother went on years later to be married and raise a son in Georgia. She had a happy life after all.
Yeah. I'm sure that is really, really fabulous. But she didn't tell anybody about this, right?
No, my father thought that she'd been at a home for wayward girls. And again, his grandparents, her mother and father, raised him in Duluth as the youngest of a big family.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and the only other thing I knew about her history there was my dad said that's where she learned to be a good cook.
Mm-hmm. Well, they cooked. They
Yeah.
cooked and cooked there. So I think I met the daughter of a woman who worked there, who said that her mother always told her how rigorous the training was there. How hard they worked the girls, but how clean the girls were, and, learned all that household stuff. I'm just looking to see if we're kind of running out of time. There was no church affiliation with this. And somebody said, if I missed this, were they recommended by teachers and clergy's parents, or both? I mean, Franny French-Moore says anyone can recommend them, to go to this school. I do know that her mother did not want her to go. Her parents did ask the court to be lenient. The parents asked for her to get out of there. But that didn't matter, because you can now, all you want, ask for prisons to let your family members out, and they're not going to do it, and it was the same then. That was it, they were in prison, so they weren't just allowed to leave, no matter what pleas the family members made, or arrangements they tried to make. I think it was very difficult. And good, Stephanie is going to reach out for me. Anybody reach out to me. I'm happy to hear from people. I'm so easy to find. It's just SheilaO'Connor.com, and it just clicks to, I don't know, about the author or media or something, contact me, and it goes right to my Gmail account. So you can do that, or I can just give you my email address is info Sheila, SHEILA, don't forget the O at the end, info SheilaO@gmail.com. I'm typing it into the chat feature. Well, thank you so much for having me, and for being interested in this story, and for spreading the news of this history, and just illuminating what was done to these girls, and so many of them, and whose stories were just unknown. Nobody really knew what happened to these girls when they went away to Sauk Center. I had a woman who was in her late 80s at an event in Edina, and she said she was in a classroom as a kid, and they came and took a girl to Sauk Center, one of the classmates in a small rural town here in Minnesota. And she said she spent her whole life wondering what happened to that girl and what she had done. She wondered what she had done. And if nothing else comes of this, you know, what I've come out to say is, you know, not to look at those girls and wonder what they had done, but wonder what was done to them. And so thank you everybody. And I'll look at your little notes, but are we going to sign off now, Mariah?
We'll get close. Thank you so much, Sheila, for this presentation and for being willing to do this virtually since we still couldn't do it in person. It was fun because I think we were able to reach even more people. Patty Ann mentioned that her book club with the League of Women Voters is discussing the book. If you would like to join a book club discussion about it as well, in March on the 18th, which is ironic because that's really close to when we were supposed to have this event last year, the Dakota County Historical Society Book Club is also doing this book.
Oh, fantastic.
Yes, so they will be discussing it. It is a virtual meeting. It's at 7 p.m. on the 18th, and you can find that on our website in 2021. But we just thank you so much for doing this and sharing your story. Do you want to tell people where they can buy your book?
Yeah, I will just say again, it's called Evidence of V, and it looks like this with a picture of one of the girls from Sauk Center holding her baby on the front. And it's available on Amazon. It's available at all of the Minnesota bookstores. You can special order it if the bookstore isn't open right now. I think because it won the Minnesota Book Award, it was in most bookstores, but it also, they could be out of it, you know, because they had trouble keeping it in stock, and you can get it through Rose Metal Press, but I'm sure you can get it through Majors and Quinn. And you know, Red Balloon in St. Paul, which was filling the orders online, ordered all of the Minnesota Book Award books, even though they weren't kid books. They had them all. So you could also try Red Balloon in St. Paul. It's a very unusual format in the book. So, I mean, I think it's worth having in your hand. You know, it's got lots of documents in it, and these documents are interesting. And as I said, the bibliography in the back for anyone wanting to do a deep dive will be able to get all kinds of resources. I put everything in there. Okay, thank you very
Wonderful.
much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.